And then joining Grace in this session is Bradley Rebeiro. He is an associate professor of law at Brigham Young University. His research ranges from U.S. constitutional history to comparative constitutional inquiries. His book manuscript, Natural Rights, Reconstruction, Frederick Douglass, and Constitutional Abolitionism, explores the constitutional thought of Frederick Douglass and its influence during Reconstruction. Thank you.
Right to vote was also a duty that all citizens of a democratic society held. You did not simply have the privilege to vote, but you were obliged to participate politically, to vote in a manner that would promote the common good. Now, what will follow is an account of Douglass's fight for Black suffrage during Reconstruction and how viewing voting as a duty was integral to Douglass's advocacy for the 15th Amendment. Now, Frederick Douglass, the man, he lived a remarkable life. If you haven't yet, please read his personal narrative, My Bondage and My Freedom. I promise you'll look at not only the history of the U.S., but also its promises differently after reading this. He was born as a slave. He was born into slavery, but eventually gained his freedom. So from a former slave, he turned activist as a prominent abolitionist in the antebellum era, and eventually turned a statesman in the Reconstruction era. And for this address, I'm going to mostly focus on Frederick Douglass, the statesman. As the Civil War drew to a close and the North looked to be victor, Congress set its sights on bringing the emancipation to its next natural step in its evolution, the complete abolition of slavery. Having freed slaves in the rebel states by decree, the time had now come to secure the freedom of all U.S. inhabitants by constitutional amendment. And the 13th Amendment did just that. It ensured the basic liberty of all individuals in the U.S. But now that the former slaves were free, the work had only just begun. And the next natural step in that progression in respecting all persons' human dignity was to secure their civil rights, allowing them to take their place as equal citizens in the Union. Now, during this time, Douglass energetically supported the 13th Amendment, calling on the nation to secure explicitly what he always thought the Constitution implicitly held, that men were born with certain inalienable rights, and these rights required that they be free. But when they turned their sights to civil rights, Douglass remained fixated on political rights. In fact, during the fierce debates in Congress over the public over the 14th Amendment, the amendment that would secure the civil rights of U.S. citizens, we find that Douglass was largely dismissive of the entire debate. Now, this is surprising, given the importance of the 14th Amendment at the time. After all, it overturned Dred Scott, which you've already learned about today. It put beyond question the fact that freedmen were indeed citizens, and that they, in fact, did have rights that white men were bound to respect. But Douglass's contributions to dialogues concerning the 14th Amendment were generally limited to one observation, that the 14th Amendment simply was not enough. It was deficient for one reason and one reason only. It did not grant Blacks equal political rights. Well before Appomattox, suffrage was of great concern to Douglass, and it preoccupied nearly all of his efforts during Reconstruction. Now, you might find this a little curious. After all, one might assume that a nation that's poised not only to free all slaves, but eager to secure their most basic civil rights against encroachment from former slave masters, that they would embrace the opportunity to ensure that those slaves became equal participants through equal voting rights in the newly reconstructed republic. Now, while this might have been true of many, there were still many others that were adamant that Blacks be secured in their civil rights, but no more. We must understand this context, after all, because it's going to help illuminate Douglass's understanding of the nature of voting, but also help us discern why Douglass's arguments took the shape that they did at that time. So we find throughout Reconstruction that Douglass made a variety of arguments for why Blacks not only deserved, but needed the right to vote. His arguments were in many ways informed and shaped by the principal opposition to the right to vote, which might have been said to have come from largely two different sources. One source of opposition to Black suffrage came from general apathy. those who felt that the Union simply had done enough for Blacks in setting them free. Perhaps Blacks could be granted the right to vote in the future, but the time simply was not yet ripe. The nation needed time to heal from its wounds before any more social upheavals. What was more, most Blacks were not even ready to vote. They needed to learn how to be free, how to work and labor for their own fortune before they sought other privileges of citizenship. Another source of opposition, equally formidable, if not more damaging to the Black suffrage movement, was the opposition posed by women suffragists. Led by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, these women, once allies in the abolitionist movement, found the prospect of Black suffrage without granting women suffrage at the same time to be simply unpalatable. But what started out as arguments to include women's suffrage in short order became arguments to outright block Black suffrage. Now, Douglass experienced firsthand the dark specter of apathy and reluctance to grant Black suffrage at the hands of President Andrew Johnson, Abraham Lincoln's successor. Not long after Johnson took office, Douglass visited him with a Black delegation in hopes of securing his support for Black suffrage. But Johnson admonished them for their general lack of gratitude for what already had been achieved, even cutting Douglass off, curtly telling Douglass and the delegation that they failed to fully appreciate what had already been accomplished for Blacks. What is more, even if there were public support for Black suffrage, Johnson argued it simply was not prudent to grant them suffrage at that time. In the future, perhaps, yes, but certainly not then. Now, Johnson's hesitancy on the one hand and outright opposition on the other reflected the general political sense at the time. Some opposed Black suffrage for a variety of reasons, based on prejudice, fear, or simple and overall concern for political stability. In other words, some people just thought it was too much change too fast. We freed nearly 4 million people. Granting them the right to vote would simply change the entire fabric of the American Union, and it was too much, at least at that time. Now, perhaps most surprisingly to Douglass, however, was the opposition he faced from an unexpected corner. During the antebellum period, as mentioned earlier, abolitionists and women's rights advocates shared similar goals. Both sought to bring into stark reality the hypocrisy of a nation that touted the Declaration of Independence as its lodestar, yet enslaved millions. If all men were created equal, then why were some 4 million persons enslaved and nearly half the population denied basic civil rights, most important among them the right to vote? Douglass at this time was a strong advocate for women's suffrage in the late antebellum era, and many women leaders ceaselessly called for abolition, even as they sought equal rights for themselves. Douglass, Stanton, and Anthony were close friends and equally supported each other in their efforts. There was a real sense that injustice for some was truly injustice for all. But Reconstruction, unfortunately, brought a rift in this once strong alliance. Elizabeth Stanton and Susan B. Anthony combined with Democrats to push women's suffrage. Democrats, they would introduce petitions from women's suffrage advocates into conference, generally as an effort to derail calls for Black suffrage. These Democrats argued, if we're to extend anyone the right to vote, it should be to women. After all, they are more fit to vote. Women, in turn, began championing the slogan, educated suffrage. Recently freed men were simply unfit to vote. They were denied an education while enslaved, which, although sad, it made it so that they could not possibly be expected to make informed decisions in elections. They couldn't even read. How could we possibly expect them to actually make good decisions? Now, this friction in this regard came to a head in the Equal Rights Convention of 1869, which Professor Lash mentioned earlier. Anthony claimed that if the right was to be given to anyone, the nation ought to, quote, give it to the most intelligent first, end quote. Now, Douglass responded, reminding all at the convention of the precarious nature and situation of Blacks in the South. For Blacks in the South, the idea of voting wasn't simply a matter of right, but it was a matter of need. Literally, if they don't have the right to vote, then it might actually lead to their death. It's either we get to vote or we die. That was Douglas's mentality. And after this, and what might be seen as a move of reconciliation, Douglas proposed that women's suffrage be pursued after Black suffrage was secured. And to this, Anthony responded, quote, "We are in a fight today," end quote. Stanton and Anthony further peddled the theory that Black suffrage would actually be a danger to women. If Black males were granted the right to vote, women would suffer under even more oppression. This theory, though short-sighted in many ways, it might not have been entirely unfounded. After all, many who advocated for Black suffrage argued that whites should grant it because suffrage was a manly endeavor. Blacks had proved their manliness in the war, and to deny them voting rights was cowardly. A real man would not be worried about Blacks voting. Employing this rhetoric of manliness only served to stoke the fear of women's rights advocates. In women's minds, Black men wanted the right to vote so that they could simply join white men in oppressing their women counterparts. It was in this context, fraught with tension, that Douglas needed to make the case for Black suffrage. One thing he knew was that he would need something more than just claiming that Blacks had a right to vote. After all, women also believed that they had a right to vote, and white men believed even if Blacks had a right to vote, Blacks were simply not prepared to vote and were better served focusing on gaining employment and making a new life in their newfound freedom. So Douglas would eventually arrive at a conclusion that would answer the contention of opponents, but also carry the question of voting beyond this question of privilege or rights alone. Douglas would argue that voting was ultimately a duty that Blacks had to fulfill, and whites had a duty to grant them that right to vote. To be sure, Douglas believed that a proper understanding of human beings' natural rights provided a sound basis for providing universal suffrage. All human beings were endowed with certain natural powers, most important among them being the moral capacity to choose between right and wrong and the intellectual ability to discern between the two. What was more, the state of nature evinced the naturalness of community and obligation. We did not exist as atomistic, isolated beings in nature. Rather, we were fundamentally social in nature and entered into the social compact or entered into government to mutually assure one another's rights. Thus, we are naturally bound to each other, creating a mutual obligation to govern and be governed. But one might still ask, what exactly established this duty, and to whom was it owed? Again, Douglas argues that governments, they're instituted to protect the natural rights of the community which governed it. In return, the community promised to fulfill certain obligations or duties to further the common good of the state. The key word here for Douglas was citizens or citizenship, the marker that designated an individual a part of a very specific political community. Claiming citizenship granted the individual certain protections, but also carried certain duties that the citizen had to fulfill. The principal duty among these being allegiance to the community. This allegiance was displayed in many ways, including fighting for the community against all enemies, foreign and domestic. Blacks achieved just this in the Civil War. Throughout the Civil War, Douglas implored Abraham Lincoln to employ Blacks in the war effort. He always quipped, "Why are we fighting with one hand in front and one hand tied behind our backs? Why not employ Blacks in the war effort?" Douglas was adamant about getting Blacks to participate because he thought it would bring the war to a decisive conclusion in favor of the North. But more importantly, it would put Blacks' claim to citizenship beyond reproach. Unsurprisingly, when the Union finally permitted Blacks to join the war effort, Douglas focused much of his energy convincing them to join the fight, and join they did. Now Blacks had proven beyond a doubt that their allegiance belonged to the Union, that the fate of the Union and that of Blacks were inextricably intertwined. Now, concerning these duties, many at the time would actually agree with Douglass that duties were those obligations specifically held by citizens or official members of the political community. Citizens did have an obligation to, for instance, uphold the laws of the community in which they resided, and when the time came to it, to take up arms in defense of that community. But Douglass added this third obligation, to participate in the political process. Just as the first two obligations were associated with providing stability and safety to the country, so too could the community remain secure only if a substantial majority, if not all, of the community exercised their political rights. Douglass made the case for why it was not only in the interest of Blacks, but also whites, that Blacks exercise the right to vote, making three major points. First, all in the community had an interest in preserving the rule of law and maintaining a safe community. This, after all, was the purpose of leaving the state of nature for political society. Though the Civil War had ended, civil unrest and injustices continued to abound. Douglass continually to try to impress on white Northerners the precarious nature of Blacks in the South. Black codes and the like demonstrated that though slavery had ended nominally, it still very much remained a reality for most Blacks in the South. Anything short of granting Blacks the right to suffrage was to leave their future to fortune. The hard-fought gains of the Civil War would have been for naught. Indeed, when differentiating Black claims to the right to vote from women, Douglass again constantly repeated that though voting was a matter of rights, for Blacks, it was also a matter of life and death. And inasmuch as the community shared a similar fate, the plight of Blacks was in fact the plight of all. Second, and a close companion to the first, for Reconstruction to be successful, Blacks needed the right to vote. White Northerners risked a second war and reopening old wounds if they did not grant equal suffrage. Douglass pointed to the Reconstruction Acts, for instance, as evidence of this when Blacks were granted the right to vote in former Southern states, now turned military districts, equitable and progressive constitutions and elections abounded. What was more, Northerners' interests were furthered as Blacks came out in droves in favor of, for instance, Republican presidential nominee Ulysses S. Grant. Blacks had proved to be a viable force for achieving aims of Reconstruction. And there was some evidence to suggest that Douglass wasn't just blowing smoke. Grant, after all, the Republican nominee, actually may not have won the popular election but for Blacks. He beat Richard Seymour by about 300,000 votes, and about 450,000 votes for Grant actually came from Blacks. So for white Northerners, at least, Douglass believed that this created an obligation to see to it that Blacks not only had the right to vote, but that they were effectively able to exercise that right in favor of stability and the Union. Now, while the first two could be simply construed as a duty that citizens had to ensure others could vote, the last reason fell squarely on the shoulders of each citizen individually. Voting, Douglass argued, was an educative endeavor. This was in response to those who denigrated Black suffrage in favor of educated suffrage. Being granted the right to vote placed a certain esteem from the community upon the individual. Each individual, in turn, needed to be worthy of said esteem, causing them to educate themselves on all pertinent political matters, so that they might exercise good judgment when they vote. Thus, the general populace would naturally elevate itself as the responsibility of ruling and being ruled became a reality for each and every person. Conversely, no voting rights led to less desire to improve, and individuals were more likely to be a burden rather than a benefit to society. Therefore, the citizen that contributed to the common good would permit others to vote and ensure that they themselves voted. And ultimately, Douglass's efforts were rewarded with the ratification of the 15th Amendment, which reads, The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. In Douglas's own words, quote, henceforth we live in a new world, breathe a new atmosphere, have a new earth beneath and a new sky above us. We were always men. Now we are citizens and men among men, end quote. So that leaves us with this question. What might Douglas's understanding of voting mean for us today? In one sense, it certainly would mean that most, if not all, citizens should be permitted to vote. Each citizen benefits from ensuring that other citizens are able to exercise their right to vote. This promotes allegiance to the community, stability in the rule of law, and ensures the common good. On the other hand, each citizen has a solemn duty to ensure that they exercise their right to vote. And human beings being what they are, those who have the right to vote and are aware that their fellow citizens expect them to exercise that right will more likely seek to educate themselves on the relevant facts and make informed decisions. This, in turn, will better promote general prosperity among citizens and ensure that wise leaders and policies are chosen. Hiding in the shadows and simultaneously building apathy and resentment toward the regime would no longer be an option, or at the very least, much less likely. Thus, if we imbibe Douglas's spirit of voting, we too might be able to live in a new world, breathe a new atmosphere, and have a new earth beneath and a new sky above us. Thank you.